Welcome back to the third instalment of Guido Talks. Despite the lockdown and the bank holiday, if anything, this week has been even more busy than the last one. Today, I am again joined by Guido Talks founder and editor Paul Staines and reporter Christian Calgie, and I'm Tom Harwood. If you haven't worked it out already, we are the three people who will be talking every week. You're going to get used to it. You're watching Guido Talks, the weekly roundup of all things Guido. Let's kick off this week with the bonkers shadow sage or activist sage committee story from Monday. Why was it so bizarre, Calgie?
Well, we had the big fanfare launch on Sunday night of independent sage, which was going to be some outside experts contributing to the debate on how the government is going about the lockdown and other aspects of dealing with the pandemic. And it took us all of a couple of hours on Monday morning to go through the membership list and discover that 9 out of 13 of those involved, 70%, were left-wing, either pro-Labour, pro-EU or anti-Tory activists. And we got the news out before their launch, and despite the large fanfare, we, for some reason, haven't heard much from them since, because it did discredit where they were coming from. And you have the chair, who notoriously had advised Blair and Brown to promote diesel cars, and you look at their record, and suddenly there wasn't much interest in hearing from them anymore.
Well, absolutely.
Pro-Labour activists is a bit of an understatement. I mean, there were two actual communists. One of them, Suzanne Michie, who funds the Communist Party, actually married to Murray, who was Corbyn's advisor, and father of Laura Murray, who was in charge of investigating anti-Semitism. She's currently being sued by Rachel Riley in an anti-Semitism-related matter. So it was quite a motley crew.
These are heavily involved political figures. It actually didn't take long to look through the broadcast session of their discussion of their Shadow Sage meeting to see they just were constantly talking about austerity and government policy, not really related to the issue at hand at all. It was clearly very politically charged, this discussion, so much so that one of the members of the committee actually said, hang on, let's row back, let's stop talking so much about politics and try and focus a little bit more on COVID-19. That's the level of politicisation that this committee has. It's totally discredited, in my view.
I think this story this week, that was probably our most impactful story, because if you looked on Sunday, there was all the flyers and the Sunday papers, and then 5 minutes before they launched, our story hits the Twitter and out there, and you saw quite respectable, middle-of-the-road commentators saying, maybe there is something a bit fishy with these characters, and maybe it's not the right way to go about it by recruiting a lot of people who are on the extreme of the academic medical world, to be honest.
Right, there's nothing wrong with being a scientist and being a socialist. And in any committee, you'd expect there to be a sort of variety of political views, perhaps. But there is something deeply concerning and perhaps suspicious about a committee that is overwhelmingly not just of one political opinion, but activists for that political opinion. Then something starts to smell a little bit wrong. And it's surprising how easy it was to find some of these people who are almost amateur political commentators on Twitter constantly. One that was particularly funny to sort of find was a professor at LSE who doesn't seem to have all that much written up about him until you Google in the Greek news, because he's a former Greek MP for their Socialist Party. And suddenly I was going on Google Translate and reading through all of these articles about when he was serving in the socialist Greek government as a politician. This is one of the people that they had on the committee.
Communist, wasn't he? He was the Greek Communist Youth former head.
That's exactly right.
I thought the funniest one was the chair, Sir David King, because this was a guy who was seeming to command quite a lot of respect from the mainstream media. And then you look into who the guy is, And not only did he lose his job as a result of cuts made by Boris as Foreign Secretary, so there's already an axe to grind, but he'd actively complained the government weren't putting him on the media enough. And all of a sudden, he's all over the media attacking Boris. And you wonder whether these two things are connected in any way.
Quite. Well,
Yeah.
I think why this matters is that if we hadn't of revealed just what the caliber and the character of these characters was, right now we'd be having a sort of parallel Sage discussion, and everything they said would be being compared, an actual shadow to the real Sage advisory group, which, to be fair, hasn't covered itself in glory either.
No. This week we've also seen one of the members of Sage having to step down. I don't know, Paul, if you could take us into a bit more detail about that.
Okay, so Neil Ferguson was the epidemiologist stroke statistician who's based at Imperial College, if I recall correctly, and he has been influential in a number of studies. Anyway, if you remember back to the beginning of the pandemic, there was a sort of move towards having a Swedish-style approach. And then all of a sudden it flipped. And it flipped because Neil Ferguson had developed a model, which is quite controversial now, which said up to 500,000 people would die if we carried on the course we were. And at that point, the whole tone and strategy of the government seemed to change and pivot. And we went into lockdown and quite heavy suppression tactics to be used in the fight against the pandemic, which is controversial itself. The embarrassing thing that's happened for Neil Ferguson, and he was one of those people you'd see in the Downing Street briefings and on telly being a pundit saying how it's all terrible and how we all want to stay at home, was that his girlfriend was trekking across London to see him for a bit of one-to-one academic discussions, so to speak. Now, she's a married woman. It's their business, not ours, what they do. But the hypocrisy of her and him getting together, breaking the lockdown rules more than once was too much, and he quite rightly resigned.
Yeah, it was the scoop we were all waiting for. I mean, we had a lot of fun when the chief medical officer in Scotland had to resign for breaking the rules, but then this had the added joy of an extramarital affair going on in the background, and it all provided, at the same time as the hypocrisy aspect, which was the reason he stood down, a bit of brevity to the week's
it did
news.
Cheer people up.
Well, and on top of the story itself, then we found out that a few weeks ago she'd actively been complaining that the lockdown was providing quite a strain on her marriage because she was having to spend so much time with her husband.
I bet it's great now, the pair of them back home. Just...
and she turned out to be a bit of a political activist herself, didn't she, Calgie?
Yeah, very much in favour of free movement. She was a pro-EU activist and had been organising rallies amongst young people, both against Brexit and I think against the US presidential election for some reason. She's a senior campaigner at Avast and had been heavily involved in
She's actually quite a green as well, isn't she? She's sort of on the edges of Extinction Rebellion, so I'd have thought she'd be quite happy with the whole lockdown, no planes flying, nobody driving, and the air being a lot purer. So it's not all bad for her this month, is it?
Well, that's the typical attitude of the most fervent Green campaigners. They want everyone else to follow their rules, but for them, they're the ones allowed to fly and travel and break lockdown and all that sort of stuff. But anyway, moving on, we have had another quite big story that came about on Thursday morning, and that is Nadia Whitham, the baby of the house, the youngest MP at 23 years old, Labour MP, quite a Corbynista, and she has been making the news all over the place last night and this morning. Why is that, Christian?
Well, we were treated to a Mirror exclusive. No idea how they got their hands on that one last night, where Nadia Whitham had supposedly been fired from her voluntary job at a care home for criticising PPE provision, and it caused quite the scandal, and everyone leapt on it. And at face value, that seems quite shocking, but you actually start gathering the evidence and the story doesn't play out as she portrayed it, because this is a care home where there hadn't been a single coronavirus death. They themselves have said they have 3 months supply of PPE, and actually her political posturing, her political campaigning had been worrying the residents, and she'd been putting her political activism ahead of the well-being of the people she was supposedly looking after. And at that point, the actions of the care home become completely justifiable.
It also,
yeah, I mean, I was a bit suspicious of her. I mean, she's come across our radar before. When she was trying to get selected, she kind of gives the impression that she's a sort of working class, hard-working girl. You know, it's not quite like that. She went to a private school. She comes from a very comfortable background, and she's one of these faux proletarians that the Corbynistas seem to throw up all the time. And when she was getting selected, let's just say she did confuse the matter of whether she went to state school or private school, and also kind of pretended to come from a not so leafy suburb of her local area and make out that she came from a more rundown area. You know, she's a bit of a fictional CV writer, I think.
yeah, to put it mildly, this is someone who has got a bit of a history of bending the truth a little bit and promoting things for political ends that aren't quite as they are. But what I found very odd about this is that none of the mainstream press that reported this case actually reported anything that was in the letter that was sent by the care home saying, actually, we won't be needing your services anymore. She'd only worked as a casual worker in there for 8 shifts over the course of this pandemic. Now, that's not a lot. And actually, if you think about it,
be fair, Tom, they've only read it on Guido today. Well, it'll take till at least tomorrow before they print it in the newspapers. You know, they can't do it just like us. Be reasonable.
Fair enough, but this is bizarre, right? This is someone who, let's face it, has been popping in and out, probably popping in and out of Parliament in London and then going back up. Is that really the best idea, to have people coming in and out of care homes quite so much? The care home that she's been working at has done very well to not have had a single COVID death and to have 50,000 pairs of gloves and whatever else it's been saying it has in terms of provision. Perhaps her services weren't actually that useful in the first place. And the letter isn't really a sacking. You'll notice a lot of the places people are saying sacking in inverted commas, and that's with good reason. She was a casual worker. And
you say casual, I say dilettante. You know, she was like those celebs who go to refugee camps and get their picture taken with a crying baby. I mean, it's a little bit poverty tourism and sort of like that, isn't it?
It does have that same slight air, and it's interesting that she was spending just as about the same amount of time in that care home as talking to media and in TV studios, talking about things that she actually wasn't necessarily experiencing in that care home, which has been saying it has got lots and lots of PPE equipment. Whereas let's not deny that there aren't real problems with PPE provision in some places in the country. It would be nice if broadcasters and newspapers spoke to the people that are working in the care homes that do have the problems and who don't happen to be MPs or political activists at the same time. But moving on from that curious story, it's about time to talk about the other big mess that the government has got itself in this week, and that is the NHS App. Now, this is an app that, quite controversially, the UK government is designing in-house and ordering around a centralized system where people's data is going to be sent off to a centralized NHS database to use so that the government can see where the hotspots are and deal with policy. But the problem with that centralized idea is that it goes against the policy of the two major mobile operating system providers, Apple and Google, who have safeguards in around how Bluetooth can be used so that apps, third-party apps, can't track users with good reason. There are lots of regimes around the world who we wouldn't be wanting to give this power to. So unlike countries like Germany or Ireland that are using the Apple Google API to develop apps that work within those privacy constraints and therefore work all the time, not using much battery and are useful, but don't provide that centralized database to government, the NHS has decided to design its own app that doesn't work within the Apple Google API, that tries to collect all this data, send it off to central government, but because of that is restricted by the operating systems, meaning that it doesn't really work all the time. You have to continually keep opening the app in order for the Bluetooth to be connecting, which really rather defeats the point.
Didn't you come up with a list of 10 problems with the app that really got the Department of Health and Social Care quite motivated? I think I got a late night email from them demanding we could make our 10 corrections. And I did say to them, you have to wait till tomorrow until we consult our experts. And they came back, didn't they, Tom?
They did. We had a team of experts go over this rebuttal that the Department of Health and Social Care put to us quite late at night. Overnight, our team of experts went through the points one by one and explained why they were so full of spin. It's really worth, if you have the time, and it's a long bank holiday weekend and we're all stuck indoors, so please do, go and look at the rebuttal article on Guido Fawkes and just see that dialectic between our original points, the Department of Health's rebuttals, and then our experts' rebuttals to those rebuttals. It's a really interesting read, and it looks like, I think, the Department of Health is going to have to U-turn on this.
I think they're going to have to, and of course the farce didn't end there, because we had something coming out last night driven by a story in The Sun that said Apple were loosening the restrictions on its software, so this could constantly run in the background and function as you would hope it to. It wasn't too long after that Apple explicitly came out and said that the Sun story is wrong. There is no special API, no arrangement, and no special treatment. And it does look like the app is going to have problems. Despite that, we learned today already, since it launched on Monday, there have been about 29,000 downloads of this app, which is in 3 days quite impressive. It's about 20% the population of the Isle of Wight, who are the only people who have access to it at the moment. But it's a wider issue. We saw earlier in the pandemic, there was a paper written by the ASI that there was quite a lot of agreement with, on centralisation of testing with NHS England. And this seems to be the same problem, which is the propensity to keep things too centralised and not let the private sector do things in the more efficient way we know they can.
Absolutely. It seems like there's been wasted time here. When it came to testing, trying to keep things in-house, I think they called it a command and control strategy within the NHS. That meant that we couldn't ramp up testing that quickly. And then finally, when charities and universities and the private sector was brought in, that's when testing seriously started to be ramped up. Similarly, I think we're going to see a bit of a U-turn on this app, just like what's happening in Australia right now, actually. In Australia, they brought out a similarly centralized app that didn't work that well when the phone was locked, which is the most of the time that people have a phone in their pocket, why the app is supposed to be used. It's not been working that well, and now they're changing to a decentralized model. I think the NHS will have to do that if they want this app to work.
To be fair to Matt Hancock, I mean, he's the only minister I've ever known who's got his own app. He is quite savvy on these things. He is trying to drive technological change. Now, I don't think they'll admit it will be a U-turn, but there might be quite a change in the software development or something akin to that, where they incorporate some of these changes that will be necessary. I don't think they've got an ideological reason to go with the approach they're taking on Bluetooth. I mean, they might have an ideological reason wanting it centrally controlled, but I think with all the privacy concerns, they may have to compromise on that.
And let's hope that they do. But that was just about all that we had time for this week. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and we'll see you again rounding up next week, next Saturday. Take care.
Bye.